Mulch is one of the most common and most important features of a healthy home garden, but it's also often misunderstood, and for good reason. When you say the word mulch, some people think of wood chips or bagged, dyed, shredded wood from Home Depot. Other people set their lawn mowers to mulch when they don't want to collect the lawn clippings. Mulch is a noun, a verb, and an adjective. This garden bed is mulched. But it only occurred to me recently that with how often gardeners like myself use this term, it can be a little confusing to new gardeners because it's such an ambiguous term, and a lot of people don't think to explain it. So as simple of a concept as it is, I want to talk through some of the ins and outs of how to select and use a good mulch. And a spoiler, the overall theme is going to be it depends. There's no one size fits all for mulch material. It all depends on what's available to you, where you're using it, and for what purpose. As a very broad definition, mulch is just any material that is spread over the surface of the soil. If I say I'm going to mulch this garden bed, it means that I'm going to cover it with something. Now, the reason for covering the soil is because of many, many factors, all of which could be summed up by saying it's how nature does it. Of course, deserts are the exception, but when we look at areas of high plant production, like meadows, forests, we see very little bare soil. And where there is bare soil, it's in patches where plants aren't growing, and it's for pollinators who burrow into bare soil to dig underground tunnels to lay their eggs in. The key thing there is that it's not where plants are growing. Bare soil compacts quickly. It's susceptible to erosion and it dries out rapidly. And we don't need to go in depth into science of how all that works. It's immediately observable when you compare soil that's been left bare with soil that's been covered by something. The questions are, what material should be used to cover, how thick, and how frequently should it be reapplied? So that's where we'll spend the rest of this video. First off, the what. In this garden, we're using several types of mulch for various purposes, so we'll start here. Straw is a classic mulch material. It's lightweight, which means that it's easy to spread and easy to brush aside. It almost floats above the soil surface, which comes with a few downsides I'll get into. But it's also an organic material, meaning that it comes from something that was once alive. In this case, I believe this straw comes from wheat, and it was harvested pretty nearby. I got it from a local farmer who doesn't spray anything on their crops. It's not USDA organic, technically, but it's good enough for me. You do need to check if you're going to use straw or hay for a mulch, specifically if it's been sprayed with herbicides. Some herbicide residue can last years intact before decomposing, and so they can harm your plants and contaminate your soil. Always best to ask if it's been sprayed or not and with what. Typically, people recommend using straw over hay since hay comes with seeds that can sprout in your soil and cause weed problems. I've never used hay personally, but I can tell you that using straw does not guarantee that you won't have weed seeds. There are tons of kernels of wheat sprouting throughout our yard, our garden beds with this batch of straw. It's not the end of the world, but it is a little annoying. And I'll say too that it's been a bit breezy here, and so depending on where in our yard we've used the straw as a mulch, it's gotten blown away or it's blown into pathways as the season has gone on, which is kind of frustrating. All things to consider. Someone in my natural gardening community recently pointed out that getting straw bales in the fall and then leaving them outside all winter long will make the seeds swell and rot, which makes it a great spring mulch. And if you want to get even more interesting tidbits and pieces of advice from seasoned gardeners, you will definitely want to check out my gardening community. It's totally free to join. You can get access to gardening resources and help for all of your issues, whatever they may be. But back to mulches. Leaves are not something that we're mulching with this year, although we have in the past, and they're great. The benefits of using dried leaves are that they are really good for feeding soil biology. They break down into good organic matter particles in the soil, and they run very little risk of being contaminated with anything harmful. The downsides to leaves are that, like straw, if you live in a breezy environment and you apply leaves whole to your soil, they can blow away very quickly. The whole leaf acts as a sail for the wind to carry it off. So consider shredding them in advance with a lawnmower or a leaf shredder first, and they'll be less likely to blow away. Another potential problem that you might face with leaves, and we certainly have, is that caterpillar larvae can hatch on leaves, especially oak leaves. And so if you spread those on your soil, you very well could be seeding your garden beds with very hungry caterpillars who would love to eat your plants. The last thing that you want to keep in mind is that if you direct sow a crop, meaning that you put the seeds straight in the ground and then you cover it up with whole leaf mulch, the leaves are going to mat and very likely block that seed from sprouting up. This is great for suppressing weeds, but leaf mold is going to be a better mulch to top dress with since it's finer and easier for a seedling to pass through. Otherwise, you can put leaves down on the soil and then poke holes with your fingers and plant the seeds that way without covering them back up with leaf litter. But otherwise, with the exception of a few trees like black walnut and eucalyptus, which are allelopathic, leaves are a great mulch. For us, they mostly go into our compost pile after being shredded up by our chickens as part of their bedding, which brings us to our favorite and most valuable mulch, compost. Compost is microbially rich, made up of various types of organic matter, and it's pretty nutrient dense as far as mulches go. I like to use our sifted compost as our mulch. I sift out chunks a couple of times through 2 sizes of sifters. The fine material goes into our potting mix and the sifted parts go onto our garden beds. And this is what I feel like actually a really good use for this stuff, because organic matter needs to stay somewhat damp in order for it to decompose from soil microbes, but then it also degrades from UV exposure. So when we compost it as a mulch, it's getting blasted by the sun and then water's running through it whenever we water our plants. So it's constantly kind of getting this moisture heating effect, which helps break the large organic matter chunks down into bioavailable nutrients for our plants to use faster. That's not always a benefit. We use our compost as a primary source of nutrition for our plants as well. But sometimes you want a mulch that doesn't degrade fast because you have to keep reapplying it. And that's where something like wood chips come in. Wood chips are great for many reasons. Like leaves, they are very unlikely going to be contaminated with anything like herbicides and pesticides. We use wood chips in 2 primary ways here. One, in some places, we're using them in our perennial garden beds. We're in need of some more wood chips actually right now. So once we get them, we'll be applying them there. But the other main place that we use wood chips is in our pathways. It is so dry here, hardly ever rains, and so lawns are pretty tricky to keep alive. So tricky, in fact, that the city of Spokane, in the area that we live, offers an incentive to homeowners who convert their lawns into wood chip covered gardens. We like the aesthetic of wood chips more than weedy, patchy, dead grass clumps, and so in the fall, when we get our next batch or 2 of wood chips from our local arborist, we will be laying down cardboard over our weeds to smother them and then layering wood chips on top. For all of these mulches, a big question is depth. How deep or high do you layer the material? And the answer, again, is dependent on a number of factors. Obviously, what kind of plant and how you're going to be planting is going to determine how you mulch. If you're direct sowing, you don't want the mulch to be stifling, so keep it light. This, of course, depends on the type of mulch too. For straw, after direct seeding, I just go like 1 inch deep. Same for compost if I have it. For wood chips, I only use them around my established perennials, and I like layering it a few inches deep. If you're reapplying any kind of mulch around the base of established plants, you can go a few inches deep, in my opinion. You don't want the mulch material to be touching the base of your trees and your bushes, because disease can spread that way. Instead, just pull the mulch back a little ways from the base of the tree, at least 6 inches in all directions. In annual garden beds, if the soil is densely planted, that's going to have a sort of mulching effect already, and that the plants themselves will be shading the soil a bit. But you still want to have organic matter feeding the soil biology if possible. But let's look at a couple of mulches that aren't going to decompose, or at least aren't decomposing as quickly, hopefully. Landscape fabric is useful for a number of reasons. Yes, it's going to shed off some amount of microplastics, which is obviously way less than ideal, but it's a full sun blocker. And except for the most intense, vigorous weeds, it's going to stop a lot of them in their tracks, or at least very greatly slow them down. That's the main reason that we use it. We burn holes in the landscape fabric and then transplant. Landscape fabric is permeable, which means that a little bit of water can get through. We run drip irrigation underneath it for our watering setup, but it also means that the soil gets to breathe, which is a big concern for some people. Under a full black tarp, the soil underneath can heat up to extremely high temperatures, which kill off soil biology. With a woven material like this, the soil does not heat up underneath. For this stuff, we'll keep it on the soil all through the growing season, then we'll take it off in the winter, roll it or fold it back up, and then reapply the next season. And we'll keep using this stuff until we've got our weeds in a more manageable spot. And there are a couple other types of mulch that we haven't covered yet that are a little unique. The first one is burlap, and burlap is an organic material that's made out of plant fibers, and it can be used similarly to landscape fabric, except that it's a bit more expensive. It does biodegrade, but it takes a long time. I'm actually using it as a way to germinate my carrots. Carrots notoriously are shallowly seeded and dry out very quickly, so it's good to keep them covered until they've sprouted and established a little bit. Once they do, I'll take these burlap sacks off. I got these from a local coffee shop. Now, unlike other organic mulches, burlap and landscape fabric are mulches that are not meant to improve soil. But living mulches, also known as cover crops, are exclusively used to improve soil. Now, you can plant living mulches in pathways and around perennials to keep the soil covered. Obviously, that means that you have to manage them. depending on how vigorous they're growing. But things like legumes and clovers are great for fixing nitrogen in the soil and also keeping it covered. The extra benefit is that they are sending roots down into the soil, which once the cover crops are terminated, the roots will decompose in place and continue to feed the soil biology. You can also just chop and drop cover crops and plant new plants directly into the garden bed. Up here in this part of our yard, we have very poor soil. So we're going at it with a few rounds of cover crops to improve the soil and try to establish some beds that we can use next season. We've already terminated these 2 beds by using our battery-powered lawnmower to chop them down to the ground, and then we covered them up the soil with Lanscape fabric without holes. Another week or 2, we'll seed another cover crop into these beds. This bed down here, we've let it go to seed a little bit so that the pollinators can enjoy the flowers, but the soil is quite a bit better here, so we might call it good after this round and then get some bush beans in there or something. You can also cycle in a cover crop as a bumper crop. The main thing when a food crop comes out of the soil is that you don't want to leave the soil bare. So if you don't have plans to replant, consider getting a cover crop mix to re-nourish your soil a bit. Other types of mulch include pine needles, rocks, and lawn clippings. If you're going to use lawn clippings from neighbors, make sure that they didn't spray them with Roundup. Grass is a phenomenal mulch, nutrient rich, spreads easily. Pine needles are something that we haven't used yet. If you're concerned about them acidifying your soil, you can check out our recent video all about that. I'm more of a fan of composting pine needles than using them as a direct mulch, but that's mostly for aesthetic purposes. Rocks are a tricky one. I personally find them useless, but they're so common that they must work for someone. The typical approach is to put Lanscape fabric or just plastic down and then cover it with smooth rocks, and that way the weeds won't come up and they become impossible to pull. But from every usage of rock mulch that I've seen, I have yet to see a rock mulched garden without weeds. The plastic will either fray or tear and the weeds will find their way to the surface. Rocks are hard to walk on with bare feet, harder than wood chips in my opinion. I personally don't like the look. They don't feed the soil biology. But if there's some reason that you really like rock mulch, the rock mulch aesthetic, and you're committed to weeding it and you don't care, by all means go for it. Sheep's wool is a mulch that we've used in a couple of different ways, although I wouldn't go out of your way to find sheep's wool to use. If you've got sheep's wool on hand, go for it. It takes a little while to decompose, but technically it is a slow release nitrogen source. For a fast release nitrogen source, just chopping and dropping beneficial plants like Comfrey makes a great mulch that feeds the soil. Although unlike sheep's wool, these will disappear very quickly and lose their sun shielding effect. Which brings us to the last question that we got to talk through: reapplying mulch. This one seems obvious, but again, there's a lot of things that seem obvious for people who have been doing this for a while, and then it never gets stated for newcomers. So here it is. My general advice for reapplying mulch is to do it once it's gone, once it's decomposed. Of course, this applies only to organic mulch as a rule of thumb. I like to apply mulch at least once a year for all garden beds, and then sometimes multiple times. Really depends on what it's being used for. For perennials that are getting mulched with wood chips take so long to decompose, especially if you're growing in a dry climate like me. So you could potentially get away with reapplying them less often. The main thing is just looking at the ground and asking, do I see soil or mulch? And if you're seeing soil, add some more mulch. Now look, all of this that I'm talking about is in an ideal world. In reality, we have mulched and unmulched garden beds. Some of them we're waiting to get more materials to mulch with. Sometimes it's just that we haven't had the chance to do it. You're not a bad person if you haven't mulched soil. We have plenty of unmulched soil. And sometimes you just gotta do your best. If you're struggling to find mulch, type into Facebook Marketplace any of these mulches that I mentioned and see what people are offering in your area. Feed stores often carry straw or hay. Obviously ask about what they've been sprayed with. Look around in your area and see what other people are throwing away or piling up. We always make a habit of scavenging people's leaf bags in the fall, after asking them, of course. My grandpa gives me his lawn clippings. There are options out there, you just kind of have to look. If you're really getting stuck, join my natural gardening community on School and find someone on the map in your general area and then just send them a message asking them what they use for mulch. Who knows, you might even make a friend. Thank you as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.